Kia ora koutou, those of you who are in the room, and welcome to everyone who is online. Before we start with our session this evening, I'd just like to invite the lovely Raylene to open our session with her here.
Tēnā koutou whakaua, ka nui ngana hiki atu, mō te haere mai te whakōrero ia mātou o tātou. Ia tū, me te tahi e karaki ki te tiatanga, me te mana whairua huarahi i tēnei rā, mō reira. Whakatakata hau ki te tonga, whakataka hau ki te tonga, kia mā kinakini ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tā, kia hiaki ana tātou. He chua, he hika, he haumu, he maurio. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Raylene, and thank you very much, Dr Glen Hazelton, who's joining us all the way from Dunedin, who is one of our foremost experts in urban regeneration, although he told me earlier that he just wanted to be introduced as someone who really values getting the right thing done for city centres. So Glen's obviously has a lot of experience himself working in the urban regeneration space, and also has done work looking at what other people have done elsewhere around the country and overseas, and he's compiled some really great case studies. So this evening, Glen is here to talk to us primarily about his own experiences, but we look forward to the questions you might bring, which could be either about what's happening for Glen, what's happening in Timaru, or wanting to tap into that broader wealth of knowledge. So thank you very much, Dr Hazelton. Over to you.
Thank you very much. So I've divided my presentation into two pieces, and some people may have seen some of it before. The first part, I'm talking about the Warehouse Precinct, which was a project I worked on in Dunedin between 2009 and 2016. Then I went overseas for a while and came back to New Zealand, then saw the light and went back to Dunedin. Tempted back by the amazing opportunity to implement a Main Street regeneration. I say that somewhat tongue-in-cheek because we were running behind, and I was hoping they would have actually finished that before I came back so I could get on to the next stage. But here we are implementing a Main Street. And so I'm going to talk about that project, and you'll see a bit of contrast between the two things and some of the learnings that we even made in the first project that we didn't apply to the second one. And it's sort of a lesson in how quickly you can sometimes forget the good lessons that you learn. So the first part around Dunedin's Warehouse Precinct really talked about revitalisation and low growth environment. So at the time we were doing this sort of urban renewal project in Dunedin was after the global financial crisis. During the beginning of it, we had the Canterbury earthquake, so we had people that didn't want to loan money on heritage buildings. The land under this area is land subject to liquefaction. No one would give insurance. And generally there was not great feeling. We also had just come out of building the stadium in Dunedin, which meant the relationship between the city council and the public wasn't always that positive. And we were in a series of big rate rises, and so us going out saying we want to spend more money wasn't exactly a popular decision. But despite all that, we still got a really good outcome in the Warehouse Precinct with these buildings. So just a bit of background to the Warehouse Precinct. This is the old commercial hub of Dunedin, really. It's in the southern part of the city. George Street, the Octagon will be that way. This is heading out south. All of this land in here that's water was reclaimed before. There's businesses like Arthur Briscoe, so Briscoe's started in that area as well. And this jetty, we'll see a little bit later as well, this is where Jetty Street now is in Dunedin. So this is the old foreshore.
About what time is that?
This would be 1870s. After this, so this is the same area, and this is after the reclamation has taken place. So this area here is where Queen's Gardens and the Cenotaph is now in Dunedin, and then this is this kind of area from here across, and then a few blocks south is the area we're focused on. The area attracted big players. This is Union Steamship Company, so they were the biggest employer in the country for a while outside the government. This was their head office in Dunedin. This building is still here. I'll show you it again afterwards. But sort of no expense spared for these businesses who are building this area up. You can see here that so this is after the reclamation gain. This is the line of Jetty Street up here, up to the jetty. So gradually the reclamation, you've got great rail and shipping links. So it obviously attracted lots of big warehouses and insurance companies, etc. in that area. Wool and grain stores, and also, this started out as a 2-level building with an extra level stuck on as the economy boomed. And this, you see the whole area here really starting to fill up with some really, really massive buildings. And this is, sort of Dunedin's post-gold rush boom. This is Crawford Street. Again, lots of warehousing buildings. And for warehousing buildings, quite elaborate too. So, a lot of money going through the economy at this time. I'll show you more pics of this one later on. This is Donald Reed, it was the Otago Hub before that, and this is Jetty Street running through here. So you can see how that development is pushed out over time. This is not a swimming pool. This is actually where the Chief Post Office sits in the exchange. Here, this is the top of Sanning's. Everyone knows the big old nightclub and venue there. And again, you see Briscoe's there, big banks and all sorts of things. So it was a real generator of wealth and lots of jobs down there. So I went to Dunedin, I studied there, and then in 2010, in 2009 I went back, and when I went back, this area was the absolute pits. These are many of those buildings. These had been vacant for a really long time. Most of them very much in this condition of neglect. This one here in particular, this one in the middle, was, I'd say, is the worst building I've ever been into, the most unsafe I've ever felt. You basically had 1 metre to 1.5 metres of floorboards rotting out before the walls. There was nothing holding it together. I was always worried that it was going to collapse onto the state highway, and it was a case of just begging that owner, sending him letters constantly saying, please sell it. I know you can't do anything to this, please sell it to someone else, otherwise we're going to lose it. This one here is still not finished and has gone through many owners, but I have a soft spot for this building because my friends used to have an apartment in here, an illegal apartment, that while I was at university I spent a lot of time. And that apartment is an extra heartstring there that's being tugged to save that one, and it's next to Sammy's as well. So again, we have the Chief Post Office here that was vacant for about 10 to 15 years with basically no use going through it, and there's lots of buildings like that. I remember the first day I drove into the city and saw the lights on in that building. It was actually like a really emotional day because it was like, wow, this is coming back to life. And a lot of people said the same thing. And it was more, everything was sort of in neglect, and very few businesses able to go in. The zoning was strict to a sense that you just couldn't really operate much in there. The few things that had gone in, there were some really dodgy apartments that had gone in, but it was really down at heel. But at the same time, there was awesome little opportunities. I feel like this one here, this little laneway that goes in the back between the Warehouse Precinct and Princes Streets. This is again the old foreshore down here. So these buildings would have previously loaded from the docks behind them. Now they're about 1 kilometre from the foreshore. But I looked at a space like this, and this is like Melbourne all over. This could be incredible. So we started out, we were really lucky. Not long after I started, we had a couple of really motivated building owners in that area. We came to council and said, we want to do things differently. Can we please work together collaboratively to look at the zoning and everything, but also look at how we can get this area going. So we started out with the workshops, which were pretty traditional design charrette type workshops where we got different stakeholders. You can see they're all sitting around maps of the area, marking them up. We were asking them, put down your top 5 priorities for what you'd change in the area. And then, much to the fear of the politicians, also said, what are your top 3 dreams that you'd like to see? And despite the politicians being slightly worried about what people might come back with when they're asked what their dreams are, people were pretty sensible on what they came back with. And in the room here, you've got a mix of building owners, consultants, landowners, and businesses as well. And then this is the drop-in session. So we developed a plan, had a drop-in session that everyone could then provide feedback that we'd got things right, and council kind of adopted the plan in February 2013. Anyone here watch Grand Design? The guy did that amazing apartment on top of the heritage building in Dunedin. Ted Daniels, that's him there. Notice him in the picture. So he had property down here too. So this is what the plan looked like. It was spelt out a few overall strategic priorities, and then had a few different smaller initiatives that we wanted to undertake. There was not a lot of money for this. It was done on this relatively rag, really. So over the time, this is the yellow outline shows the area, and then the red stars are projects that got underway in the area while we're working on the project. So pretty much, 90% of the buildings down there had something happen to them over that period. We didn't expect that, given what was happening at the time, but really it sort of took off really quickly. We had a couple of key projects that got underway from private investors. And then I think what it showed was that there was a latent demand and a desire to do something, and you just needed to free it up enough to let people get on and do that work and to help facilitate that.
Sorry, how many of those buildings were listed and how many were just
in terms of like heritage protection?
correct?
So at the time when we started, there would have probably been 8 to 10 predominantly in Vogel Street here, and there wasn't as much listed through Crawford, and a few of the big ones weren't listed. So these two biggies, they hadn't been listed at the time. Now just about all of the buildings in the street are listed, and partly that was done through the last district plan. We provided an incentive that you can't undertake retail in the area unless you're in a heritage listed building. So that gave people an incentive to want to list their buildings. Otherwise, we knew we would be struggling to get them to do it. I think it's twofold. I think one is that we gave the area an organic chance to, we didn't come in and say these are the activities you can do. So we had a district plan that was really constrained, and then we worked with our hearings committee and with our planning team to go, actually, what could we kind of feasibly start allowing them to do? Because we know we're doing a district plan review. So let's kind of see what people come up with in terms of what they think the best use for those buildings is. So having a bit of flexibility in that planning space. And once we'd had one cafe, for example, go through as a non-complying activity, got a consent, the plan at the hearings can be like, we don't want to see another cafe come back, you can approve it. We don't need to put them through tens of thousands of dollars. We've already said it's suitable. So just go again. I think the other thing is really motivated owners. And just having that opportunity to facilitate things for them. Some of the pictures, so this is befores and afters. See some of the buildings obviously coming together quite quickly. Again, just befores and afters. A lot of residential going into the area, a lot of apartments, which is a really interesting thing because when I first moved back, people said, oh, no one moves to Dunedin to live in apartments. But there was, as soon as those apartments go on, they're tenanted or they're sold. There is demand there. This one up the top, this was one of the first big projects to get underway. So this has a floor plate of about 1,800 metres squared, and it came up for sale just after the Canterbury earthquakes, and I thought, this is a demolition, like no one's going to buy this. We ended up having a family who owned quite a few properties in the area come to us and said, we'll do this project, we know it will help anchor the Warehouse Precinct plan. We want 5 things from council. One was, some amenity improvements, because they were going to be bringing about 100 staff into the area, so they wanted some targeted improvements around them. Heritage Fund assistance, which we're able to provide, some rates relief during time of construction, a key person at council that could help work them through all the processes, so that became me. And the last thing they wanted was us to get Chorus to change the program of rollout for ultra fast broadband, because they are a tech business and they wanted that at their street, not the street over first, which we were able to do. Thankfully, because we're just one bigger town at the time, so it was like Chorus like this. And this bottom one, this is a building that had sat burnt out for a couple of years. This one very much had just sat there gathering moss and open to all of the elements. And again, this is a lesson of being proactive. So somehow I found out that it had sold. I contacted the owner for the new owner, who I heard it was going to be, by finding their records at council and rang them up. And at the time, they were like we're at the lawyer's office still signing the deal. But like, this is the first time anyone from council's reached out for us, so we're definitely keen to come and have a chat. And we end up giving them money and supporting them through the project, and they did an absolutely stunning job with the building, which ended up winning Property Council awards for best unit development. And again, it's the hotel at the top now, a series of apartments and a really great restaurant and a really great bakery downstairs. This is my problem child. It still hasn't been fixed up, but it has just changed hands again. Thankfully, in the new owners, I'm pretty confident about. More befores and afters, just into apartments. This one here is showing the state of the buildings. Up here, you can see like the 3 plates along the top. We also notice that those plates covered cracks right down through the building, through the base. So the building is basically split into 3. It's now been fully earthquake strengthened. There's a great cafe at the bottom and a solicitor's office upstairs. And this is the one that was like the worst building I'd ever been into. It's now fully strengthened. I actually ended up spending some of my summer helping the owner of it to polish out the interior because they felt so bad for convincing him to buy the building. So I gave him a few weekends work myself, during which he almost killed me a few times. This is his health and safety wasn't amazing. And I still think in a few years I'll probably have some lung condition from it as well.
So that's residential, that right?
Yeah, it's a mix of owner-occupied and Airbnb. And now for the first cafe that went in the area, this was like a great thing for me, particularly because one of the people that had come to the consultation very down on the whole plan had said, no one will ever open a cafe down here. And then someone did, and so I offered to take him to lunch there, but he never took me up on the offer. But again, it's that thing about like seeing the vision, and that person, when the owner of that cafe, when she came we put her through a notified hearing, she came and she spoke. And I remember the hearings panel, someone out there asking, well, what if someone else comes along? It's like a conversation. But what if someone else comes along the cafe? And she's like, I'd love it, because then it'll become a destination for people to come to. So it was kind of the owners and the businesses that were coming in kind of got the vision. Like they were also driving it, but they didn't see each other as competitors. They saw each other as partners. They knew how it was kind of important to curate the right types of businesses in the space. And there was also like a little funny group of them that started collaborating together. So one of the pictures, there was a guy who was a cabinet maker in the downstairs. So he was making all the kitchens for all the apartments and the other ones and doing their windows as well. His neighbour was an engineer, and so he'd do the structural engineering plans. One of the other owners next door owned a metal place, so he was doing the steel work for them. So they all had this little community of like doing jobs for each other as well. And it was like a really nice little creative bubble of people. And obviously Distinction Hotel went into the Chief Post Office, and we also got Silverford Farms in there. See, that was like a big moment for the city. For years, this project had been talked about, that it was going to be a hotel, it's going to be a hotel. And we'd heard it so many times, and different firms had come and gone. And finally, when it did happen, a lot of people were like, this is a real turning point for us. This guy, another one of the big buildings in the area, he was previously, he came to the first consultation meetings. I met him. He was a lovely guy, but he said, like, I love your enthusiasm. This is never going to work. This is Dunedin. It's just not going to happen. Just isn't demand. He said, no matter what you do, I don't care. But he said, don't muck up the parking on the other side of the building, which is the state highway, because my tenants need that. A few years later, he'd strengthened the building. He also changed the main entrance to this side of the street, so off the state highway onto Bogle Street, and changed the building address so he could have that Bogle Street name to it, and became a huge supporter of the project, and ended up selling that building and making quite a pretty penny off it, I do say. We did a few things really small. So overall, we spent about $1.6 million in the area on some amenity improvements, very targeted, and then things like rates relief and some heritage building grants. that is in complete comparison to the $60 million we're spending on George Street at the moment, which I'll talk about afterwards. So some small things we had, so it's just things like seating that people in the area said, although it's a heritage area, we want things that look to the future. So we didn't have faux heritage furniture. These are seats that were designed by the university that represent those, just like linked to the sailing. That one I think was the wave. There's 4 different ones I can't remember at the moment. But it was nice to get the Polytech students involved in doing something creative too. The seating, they all had lyrics from songs from bands that used to practice in the area as well. So it was kind of bringing that layer of history through. We did some stuff with lighting. These were from pottery fragments found in the archaeology, and then a modern interpretation of what that would look like today. Very basic planting. Started trying to get our street tree people to planting some native trees, which are a little slow growing, but doing well. And then we also closed, there's other pictures of this one, but actually people using it, but we closed part of the road that used to run through between the state highways. At the time, I remember at the hearings, everyone saying, there's no way anyone would ever use this space. It's right next to an overbridge and a state highway. It's too noisy, it never gets any sun. Well, there's a very successful little cafe in here now, and there's always people moving through the space. So it's kind of also just a reminder to me when people say something will never work, that if other people see the vision, it wouldn't actually work. We did, then things started sparking off around the precinct as well. So other buildings started getting done up, bringing that confidence back to that part, the surrounding areas. It's the old B and Z. Again, a building that had been vacant 10, 12 years. Back into lawyers upstairs, a few different businesses downstairs. One of the best projects, this is Ted Daniels, who did that incredible apartment. This is the project I first worked with him on. So this was reinstating the facade of the building to that. It's just an incredible building now. And then, spreading that kind of confidence that started building amongst people and developers and the public. Particularly, I think it's that demonstration effect as well, that people could see. There's always this perception that doing things with old buildings is too hard. And that if you do it, you're going to go broke or you're not going to make any money. Then we started having a whole lot of developers that were doing project after project and proving that it could be done and sort of inspiring others, but also raising the expectations that other people in the community had. So, in the past when someone would say, oh, that building's shot, it's got to be demolished, a lot of people would just accept it. They're like, oh, right. Then they'd see actually worse buildings than that getting done up. And they'd be like, well, why aren't you doing that? Why? It's kind of shifted the expectation, I think, in Dunedin about what should or shouldn't be demolished. Oh, this one's now, the old stables. I thought that was sure to be gone because you used to be able to see through all of, there was no water left, you could see through all the gaps in the brick. Now it's a really incredible microbrewery. And other people, reinstating facades around town, stripping off paint to reveal the old brickwork, taking off 1980s editions like this, finding this underneath, restoring it. And again, for me, it's always about taking some risks and trying to figure out what was going to work in the area. So this is in one of the buildings. At this time, this was being earthquake strengthened. And this guy came along and said, I'm looking for a space where I can set up an urban winery, which I didn't even know was a thing. And so he did this. It was in the building site and he set it up, and it was sort of a test for him. It was a little pop-up to see how people would respond. But it also showed us that actually that's sort of type of thing that as well, these buildings are well suited to. So a lot of the businesses that have gone in there relate in some way to production of food. There's restaurants, there's a whole lot of caterers, we've got a couple of microbreweries, and the winery guy. So what worked? The big thing for me is it's about those building and maintaining relationships. A lot of the time, you were trying to build relationships with people that had had a pretty bad experience with council in the past and didn't trust us, or just hadn't had very positive interactions. A lot of time it took, multiple visits. It wasn't just calling in once and getting feedback. It was calling in, meeting them, doing something for them. I said before that one of the guys, Laurie Forbes, who's one of the heroes of Dunedin heritage. First time I met him was not long after I started, but he had his car on the side of the road, an old vintage car that he was selling. It was on the front page of the paper. It said, I'm selling this car to pay for my consent fees to restore this building. Not a great headline for the front page of the paper. Doesn't make you feel, the council's doing what it could. Went to meet him, talked with him quite a bit. We, worked on a lot of projects, but he said the main reason that he continued to work with us is because on the first day I went down there, I promised to do something from at that meeting. I went back to the office and I did it. He said, it's the first time anyone from council had come, did what they said they were going to do. And it was a really tiny thing. I just sent him some photos. That was what I had to do. And that got it back on site. Consulting and meeting in the precinct. So we did all of our meetings down there. We had a bit of money so that we could enable some change alongside the consultation. So it wasn't, hey, look at this future vision that might never happen. Actually come along to these meetings, look at this future vision, and we've actually got some money here that we can make available to you if you want to paint your building or start doing some work on it. As I said there, the targeted financial and non-financial incentives. So we put in about $1.6 million down in Vogel Street in particular, and that leveraged more than $52 million worth of investment, private investment, which was, it's a good return for us. Highlighting change, promoting success as much as possible. For me, it was always about getting those positive stories in the paper, particularly led by those owners and the businesses down in the area. So it wasn't council shouting out the success. It was those owners saying, hey, this is the work we're doing. We're doing it in conjunction with council. They've been helpful. So it's kind of spreading that message a bit further, but also giving the public the opportunity to say to these owners, you're actually doing a really good job. Thank you. And they find that really rewarding. My main role was really just removing the barriers to development. So I used to spend a lot of my time was kind of in this, see on the next screen, the red carpet, not red tape. So my role was to pull together all of the different parts of council that a project would have to deal with and try to get us all singing from the same song sheet. So I'd have transport would be there. We'd have people from building, people from planning, people from regulatory if we needed them, and we'd try to hammer out something before we met with the owners so that we had a consistent point of view and that owner wasn't then having to go to 4 or 5 different parts of council and work everything out. And then being fluid and flexible as well while you're working through it. The original ideas that we'd had, some of the workshops and some of our out-of-town consultants had about what they thought the buildings might get used for, that's not what they ended up getting used for necessarily. But something else moved in and we needed to be able to reorient, and that was positive. I actually remember on the flexible and fluid as well, years and years ago when we were first starting the project, I keep forgetting that we did this, but our first thing, we did a pitch to Otago Polytechnic to try and get them to move their entire campus to the Warehouse Precinct. And there were some that were quite pro it, and then others, because they're being squeezed all the time by the university in terms of space, and then others that weren't. And it didn't get off the ground, but I remember we put like people work into it. But it was one of those ones that it could have come off and it could have been amazing, but we didn't give up. Like, even though they were like, no, it's not going to work for us, we're like, okay, we're still going to find some way to use these buildings. That's like sometimes the first option won't work. Being pragmatic rather than idealistic, particularly around the heritage aspects. So we focused a lot on adaptive reuse. And there's certainly changes that were made to some of those buildings that from a heritage perspective at the time and from my own taste, I wouldn't have necessarily done. But at the end of the day, sometimes it was just about finding those compromises, and I don't own the building. So I've got to let them do as much as they can reasonably. Taking a positive focus, so really focusing on what was good about the area. Providing that positive feedback. Key, having willing and motivated owners, which is something I'll contrast in my next bit. And enabling rather than doing. So making sure that open the door for the private sector to do it. A lot of other places around, sort of wealthier cities around New Zealand might have done it in terms of we'll go in and we'll do a demonstration project. And that's what our consultants said they thought we'd need to do. The council would have to go and buy a building and do it up. And I thought, well, that's not going to show anyone anything, because our budgets are going to be different. The way we do things is going to be different. it's better to support someone else to do that. We were lucky that we did have that family come along and take on that big building, because then other people could see, shoot, if they can do it, we can do it. And then working with other groups as much as possible to find reasons to make people go to the area. This was just an example of where sometimes our consultants said, we think you need to change the one-way system to a two-way before anything will really happen down there. We're like, look, that's not something we can do at the moment. This is, what are we now, like 15 years on, what Kotahi, the university and the hospital are having this argument right now about whether we can change the one-way system. But we've proved that we could do all of this work around it without that changing. So sometimes the barriers that even our consultants perceived weren't the right barriers. They thought it had to look like this before anything else could happen. Certainly still doesn't quite look like this, but in time maybe. This is Laurie, so the one that was on the front page of the paper, selling his car. This is him in one of his buildings explaining to a whole range of people, politicians, staff, and other building owners, this is how you undertake strengthening. And this was like a key thing for us, was having practitioners and building owners themselves showing other people how it could be done. So it wasn't just, hey, go talk to Glenn and he'll tell you it's easy and it can be done. I'll say, go talk to Laurie and he'll tell you the real story. And then obviously you had a big opening for a few years. Vocal Street Party was a really big deal. We had 10,000 people turn up to the first one when we expected a couple of thousand at max. It showed that there was a lot of interest from the public in what we were doing. It was a lot of fun as well. And we also worked a lot on street art as well in the area. And I, for all my sins, became a trustee of Dunedin Street Art, even though I recall at one of the very early consultation events, someone said, oh, you should put murals up. I was like, oh, I hate murals, can't stand them. And somehow a few years later, I became a trustee of the Street Art Trust. But so, you have to admit sometimes that you're wrong. And so I arrange here, I always love this picture. These two guys, sort of like Dunedin's real hardcore punk scene out there doing his artwork. His girlfriend at the time was doing like opposite. It was the interest that this also brought was, we found that there's so many people coming for the street art trail. I remember being down there one afternoon, just talking to owners, and I watched a group of under fives that were with the university's childcare facility, all out in their little high vis with their maps, walking around looking at the artworks. And I saw this old couple who were driving them all. They would have been like in their 80s or 90s, and they had their nap, so we made our map bright pink so that I could really easily see them. And then there was like a group of middle-aged mums in their lycra out power walking doing it as well. And I was like, I've proved that like there's something for everyone now. Like everyone can appreciate this. There's that right pink map. And we're still working a little bit on it at the moment, but we all have day jobs, so we'll see. So the challenges, the slow speed of change around the district plan, and that was a constant battle to try and push that through. Perceptions of gentrification, particularly from some of the arts sector who felt that, as the buildings that were done up and were more expensive, that they were pushed out of those spaces. The reality is that there were few artists still in the area anyway, because the buildings were all in such bad state that even they had moved out. That different definitions of what a creative neighbourhood is. I actually met a guy a few weeks ago where me and my partner were hanging out with him, we were chatting, and he didn't realise what I did. And he said, oh, it's like that Warehouse Precinct thing where you said it was going to be a creative area and none of the artists were able to stay. And I was like, it's interesting. Like, why is creative just artists? Is there other things, that maybe, and it's just, people latch onto a term and think that's what it's going to be. The cost of upgrade, undermining that diversity. So again, once you've done the earthquake strengthening, you've spent millions of dollars on the building, you can't put in a tenant that doesn't pay high rent. So you risk that you're only going to end up with lawyers, etc., and more corporates. What we've been really lucky though, because we have those great building owners, they understood the importance of getting that mix of different activities in there. So quite a few of them have managed to take lower rents on some parts of the building so they can keep that interest. They look at that area more holistically. Tension with other parts of the city, particularly the area that I'm going to talk about next, which is George Street is our main retail street, who were fearful that because we put money in here, all of the retailers would move there, and they were jealous that we weren't putting money into CBD. Then it was the questions of how do we put all of the stuff that was happening into a planning framework. And actually, I think this question ended up becoming a moot point because the new district plan really drew what activities were allowing in there from what showed up. So it was actually by letting it open up a bit more, it actually helped inform our planning better. So revitalisation doesn't have to be about really big, expensive urban design projects, but I'm going to talk about a really expensive urban design project next. But it improves, for me, it was the importance of being confident, providing people with inspiration, building relationships, demonstrating gratitude, removing barriers where we can, finding that right mix of incentives, and that's not always money. I could, as an example, on a project, we might give, say, $20,000 on as a grant to someone, but actually helping them through the process and making sure that building consent gets through quicker can actually save them more than $20,000. So having good processes and streamlined processes, make sure people understand them as well as they can and can get through them easily, is just as important as throwing money at the projects. And really small scale changes can help create places that people want to go. When we go to the next one. Yeah.
I think that was fantastic, and that heritage-led regeneration, I think, is really inspiring, actually. Because what you could have seen happen there, I guess, and this probably what was potentially going to happen, was all of those buildings pulled down, something.
100%. That's what they become. They become car parks.
So to be able to demonstrate, perhaps with just the first project, that actually it can be done, and can be done economically, and can actually bring people back into the area, can then show that actually the neighbours is, well, I can do that as well.
Yep.
Why can't I do that? And actually encourage them so you get a spiral there, where actually everyone jumps on board. So you've got a lot of buildings that are being regenerated there that could have been demolished, perhaps because they weren't protected from the but actually they felt that presumably they felt that character, that what was happening there was really actually had a great vision, and was really inspiring, and actually it's created. I've been down there. It's created something which is quite unique, really, and different to the rest of the city.
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting thing for me comes out is there's that one element that is really about the building confidence, showing people it can be done, and seeing that from their peers, and seeing it's not just these other really rich developers that are doing that. These are mum and dad developers that are still making a go of it, and then they've succeeded and they can take on another building. So that's one part of it. But I think the other thing that it's shown is that most of the time when we do have a building get demolished, it does just become a car park, because the cost of reconstruction and cost of building a new building is so great that then the return people have to get from it, you can't rent things for that expensive in Dunedin. So when people say, oh, we're going to demolish this and redevelop it, unless they're a government tenant or a university tenant, it very rarely happens. I can count on one hand the number of new buildings that have been built in CBD over the last 10, 15 years. And the ones that we've got underway at the moment are all university or Kaitahu for ACC.
So it's incredibly sustainable as well, because you've got these buildings which are empty. To do that adaptive reuse them, rather than put them down and either build something else.
Yeah, what's that? It's saying nothing's greener than a building that's already built.
Exists.
Yeah.
So, so what were the key goals?
Sure.
How did it change to something like that?
Yep. So it was zoned in the 1990s. The area was zoned as large scale retail, which at the time, I think they were trying to think ahead, thinking we're just starting to get large format retail come to the city. And they're thinking, we want it to be close to the CBD. We don't want it to go out of zone, which Central City ended up doing anyway. But we have it close to the city. These are some of the biggest sites in the city, and they're all areas already kind of on the decline. So let's zone that area. But at the same time, they did that, they stuck a heritage layer over the area as well, so made it difficult to demolish the buildings. Thank God they did it. But what it meant is that, the big players, and you had to have a minimum of 1,500 square meters floor plan. Only 2 buildings in the area had that, and then they still wouldn't have had the parking. So no one could go into the area with retail as of right. Everyone had to get a consent. So as a result, they're like, well, if we're going to get a consent, we might as well choose a cheap industrial site out of town and do it. So Addy Bay Road became a large format retail area. So that was one thing. So retail was really restricted. They could do residential, but it was kind of just the start of that urban living thing. But that's obviously boomed. Couldn't do commercial offices. Could do light industrial, and that was about all that was sort of left. But most of the buildings were not suited to modern day light industrial. So the changes that we made, well, the heritage layer stayed, but you could do retail if you're in a heritage building. Commercial office was permitted, residential was permitted, but it took away the parking requirements. Light industrial was permitted. So it's pretty much free for all.
So still consent in relation to the heritage design.
Yeah, so still, if you're making changes to the exterior of the building, still heritage. Those have loosened up a little bit, but certainly there's still heritage constraints. So I came back, went away for a few years, came back, and so I'd been involved. And when I came back, I worked for Heritage New Zealand for a while. We worked on the Saving the Town toolkit, which was really to think about pulling all the things that we'd seen work in different parts of the country for upgrading heritage. And for me, the key things here were really around thinking about it as a collective rather than trying to save building by building. You get much more, as we did in the Warehouse Precinct. You can save one building, and if the next 3 get demolished, what was the point? You've got to think about what are the underlying factors in an area that are stopping all of those owners doing work rather than just that one building. We had our former mayor, Dave Cull, set up a heritage buildings economic reuse steering group, which had some council staff from different departments, owners, and technical experts. And they put down a list of all of the things that were stopping people from upgrading buildings, and we worked through which of those things we could influence. And a lot of it came down to, it was those perceived barriers sometimes of trying to get stuff done through council. So by improving the underlying conditions, you weren't focusing on saving one building, you're saving a whole lot by enabling them to be able to do something. So worked on this, and then came back to council. So we developed the Central City Plan in 2011. The reason for the plan is we're replacing all of our Three Waters infrastructure under the city, because a lot of it hasn't been replaced since it was installed in the 1860s to the 1880s. And the decision was, if we're already ripping everything up, then let's think about what we put back on top. The whole focus now has really become an argument about what we put on top, and people are kind of forgetting all the work we're doing underground and how long that work takes. So consultation and engagement around what people wanted the area to look like started in 2014 and went through to last year. There was multiple rounds of council decision making, sometimes in favour of different things, and different trienniums we've shifted as different councils have, as councils changed. We've developed the detailed business case for Kotahi, and that business case went back to council last year. So I think in 2019, council recommended that they thought it should move to being a one-way street with greater amenity space. And in last year, we put the business case back to council and said, we've gone through everything. Technically, either a one-way or a two-way can work. It is your decision, councillors, what you want to do. We're not going to recommend anything. So I put up a neutral, you need to decide based on how much more space you want for people and how much space you want for cars. That was a hugely controversial decision. Council went with one way. I think it was a 9-6 vote, and it's dominated all of the thinking since. But a few weeks ago, we finally put our developed designs back to council. I've got a few pictures of them. This is one, and we've started work now on this block in George Street. So we started on some of the surrounding streets in 2021. But as of 26, we've stuck diggers in the ground on George Street, which is quite exciting. and that will last through to 2024 as we work through the entire CBD. This is one of the renders of, so this is what we call the golden block, which has our 3 malls in it. So it's a one-way with more of a shared space environment. This block here is a particular focus around, there's a play area for young people, and there's kind of the staging areas here for outdoor entertainment. Each of the blocks has automatic bollards, so they can each be blocked off individually as well for things like festivals and weekends if people want to do that. And this is looking down on one of the other blocks, which has our, needs to be renamed, our urban lounge, which is this area outside there's a lot of food and beverage in this block. So this is a large extended area here. But a couple of things on this one that are significant as well that sort of foreshadow something I'll talk about shortly is you'll see the paving patterns here. This is strongly linked to the cultural narrative that we worked on with Kaitahu, with Okaha down in Dunedin, which the cultural narrative is a really beautiful document that talks about these are the really key principles for mana whenua, and these are the ways that we can then express these in the streetscape. The paving design here is influenced by a few different things. I have a little bit more depth on this time. For one, there's a bespoke paver pattern that we've used. You can't see it at this level of detail, but the shape of the pattern is different, and it reflects, so the poti from Poti Dunedin is a 4-sided kete, and the strength of it comes from the weave and the way the corners are developed. So the paver is shaped the same way as those corner blocks of the poti, so it's now called the poti paver. The patternation in here, these are pātiki. So these came from patterns from Otako Marae. So there's the pātiki, which is like the flounder, which is the diamond-shaped one. There's some stained glass windows, Otako with that in. And then the aramoana, which is the movement of the waves out, which also come from stained glass windows out at Otako Marae. So we've used that through the ground plane. Then we've also got a number of sayings in Te Reo that are on the furniture through the area. The colour palette is all developed from the story of Barracuda, the fish. Aka, I think is the southern dialect for the fish. So there's a lot of blues and silvers in it, so that comes through in the furniture. That's because that was one of the major trading commodities. Also from the colours come from Keruru as well, and there's a red that splashes through the area, which is from Otako Marae as well. Places like this also try to bring through the cultural narrative, because one of the key principles that the Rūnaka wanted was around kaiho kai, which is like sharing and trading, particularly sharing of food. So the idea of also that opportunity for these to be long tables there where people can come together and share their lunch, not only if you've bought something at a cafe, but that opportunity for just members of the public to come and share and interact. So that's, so this is a high level of kind of what we're doing at George Street, which has been really interesting, pulling some quite I guess they're innovative, but pulling through the mana whenua expression into a landscape that has been devoid of that that in a public way. There's one of the Raumatua down there talked about constantly how their children would come and say, there's no expression of my culture at all in the city. And you could say there's one place that you can go in Dunedin where there's a stone as a memorial. It's at down in the Exchange. It's where the waka used to be hauled out, and it's next to where the Māori hostel used to be. That's the only place that there's any expression in the city at the moment. That is about to change quite substantially, not only because of this project, but also because the new ACC building has a very strong cultural narrative, and so does the hospital, which is a pretty massive building. So it's been exciting for us, and also some of the commentary I've had back from some of the detractors. I remember this woman rang me up on some Saturdays for me and Ethel. She said, we're a Scottish city. No, we're not. It's like we're a Polynesian city. We're in the South Pacific. What do you mean we're a Scottish city? It's like, and other people said, oh, there's not enough in here. It's like the buildings are all Edwardian or Victorian. We've pretty much covered our settler history. Let's think about some others in this equation as well. But it's also, there's been a surprising amount of really positive feedback about the cultural narrative. And I've only just lightly touched on it. To me now, the project, because it started off in such a contested way, and I came back after some of that decision-making had happened, my role is trying to find the compromises and make sure this doesn't end up with people marching down George Street trying to stop the project. So my thing is always about trying to find those positive compromises between different groups. So I feel now that we've got to, we're trying to make George Street a more welcoming and attractive place, and that the key point about the being welcoming also relates back to the cultural narrative and the development of manaakitanga. So being welcoming to guests. That was again from Pataki was clear what we want the space to be. That's whether that's people of different cultures, whether that's people with disabilities, whether that's young people, whether that's old people. We want it to be more welcoming to people across the board to come to this area. So, particularly focusing for me on those people who don't feel that they can come and enjoy the area at the moment. We retained the car parking. That was our biggest, that is always the biggest debate, and anything we ever do is always about car parking. So I made a commitment I don't know how I ended up doing this. I think I was so desperate to get things through that we committed. One of the councillors said, could you guarantee that you can provide approximately the same amount of parking as there is now in the new plan? And I said, yeah, we can do that. And then I went back to my design team who had been watching the online stream and were like, why did you say that? And I was like, look, the reality is it's the only way it was going to get there, and by taking this and ensuring that we do still have that car parking, we've made the compromise that at one end of the spectrum, people wanted a full pedestrianisation. At the other end, people wanted no change at all. And so it's like, okay, we can have one lane of traffic, expand the pedestrian areas, but also still have the parking. And in that space, all of you should be somewhat happy. And more or less, some people we have won over with that. As soon as the parking was still there, we want to be able to use that parking more flexibly though. So during the day and the evening, we might shift it. It might become more outdoor space at night. We're working on how we can do that with digital signage. But it really is about trying to make it more flexible. Prioritising placemaking over thoroughfares. At the moment, still a lot of through traffic. We're trying to get rid of that. Obviously, as you move to one direction, that some of that will disappear. We also found a lot of our traffic generation was because the way you entered all about parking buildings, you had to do left-hand turns. So people would keep circling the block or turning down George Street to turn onto another street. So we've got some right-hand turns into things, and that automatically cuts out a whole lot of traffic. What I also say about the thoroughfare thing, we closed George Street this week, one lane, just for one block to start the works. And thankfully we closed that in the same direction that we're closing it in future. So there was a debate even over that. And straight away that day, we have done nothing else except put up some fences on one side and some cones. People's behaviour in that street changed that day. It was amazing. Like you go down there and people are now just filtering across the street, all over the street, because the traffic's slowed down. There's only one lane of it. And people are not using it as a through route. They're prioritising other routes, but there's still the parking there. I'm like, look, in one day, we can already see how this is going to change. We want it to be able to be used more flexibly and evolve over time. Our last major upgrade was 1989 to 1990. So it's been 30 years, and you think about what's changed in 30 years. Quite a lot. If we want this plan to work, this has got to be robust for at least 20, I reckon. We're linking it to all of our other projects around things like real-time parking information, new cycle hubs, etc. And it acknowledges that need for mode shift alongside the more conservative views that acknowledge that we have existing transport needs that most people need are still in cars. Our biggest battle with this in terms of the mode shift is when I go to talk to people, because we have a mayor who is a Green Party candidate, the first question was always like, but so the council is anti-car. It's like, no, like most of our transport money still goes to cars and you can still park on George Street, there's still going to be vehicles. What we're trying to do is make it better for people who do want to use other roads. But there's still very much this suspicion that we're just trying to get rid of. Challenges, the length of time between the engagements. So we've been consulting on this for almost 10 years. And people forget, people are like, you haven't consulted with me. No one's consulted on this. You're like, it's been 10 years. Like, just because you haven't seen it in the last couple of months, it doesn't mean it hasn't been there. And it's also because a lot of that engagement was through things like long-term plan, 10-year plan. And I think there will be something I touched on in the last couple of slides is that if you don't go and talk to someone directly in their shop, they don't think they've been consulted. Like they won't, it doesn't count unless you've got to talk to them personally. And I'm finding that even with the construction stuff today is that no one will come to workshops, no one will come to group events. You have to come and see me in my shop, which means it takes a lot of time. Politicization, so as I said, because our mayor is a Green mayor, there's a perception from many in the business community that there's some other agenda underway. And I think some of the conversations I've had with some of those people who I've got on really well with in the past, some of those conversations, one I ended and just look like, I feel like we're going down a rabbit hole here that you've got like this big conspiracy theory about what council's trying to do. And that's actually not happening. Like that you're so blinkered now to your hatred of a certain politician that, and you associate this project as their project, so you oppose it. We don't have a retail association in the city, and that's a major challenge for me because, again, it's not having one body that you can go and talk to. We hope that that will set up. The cost of lease on George Street, that is a real challenge for keeping that diversity there. The last thing I kind of want is it to end up just being all bargain chemist or, all the big brands. It's those point of difference, the local stores that really make an interesting place. Polarization, we talked about before. 10% probably super pro, 10% super anti, 80% probably either don't care, are happy, ambivalent, but we hear from that 10% that are anti and they dominate the media. And trying to find a way to bring people back is really hard. There's not, in complete comparisons to the Warehouse Precinct, this isn't being led by the developers or building owners. In fact, most of them have been quite anti the project. Or at least anti the one-way aspect of the project, though they've been a little bit quieter recently. And it doesn't go far enough for our younger people. They're saying we're frustrated that you've made these compromises. The other thing is, as I said before, people kind of forget that it's also about the infrastructure. And when we've got a lot of our pipes are 5 meters deep, there's some pretty big trenches being dug through the city at the moment. And we had one guy the other day went out to see him. He said, look, I've got a bone to pick with you. My construction lead was like, oh, okay, what's this? He's like, look at these photos. You've replaced the same pipe 3 times. I said, you realise this is a 3 waters project, so we have to replace each one of those pipes. He didn't get that like there's 3 separate pipes for different things. So people's understanding of what infrastructure is there is quite low. The amount of engagement that's expected and the resources required to do that, as I said, so many people want that one-to-one. And we worked out the other day with the amount of businesses we're in front of at the moment, that it was more than a full-time job for someone to just be going and seeing each one of them once a week for 15 minutes. So we're having to pull on more people in the project because most of the time they just want to have their shoulders rubbed, say it's going to be okay, check the timing, but they don't read the newsletters and do that they want to see you in person. So that's, it's big resources and we're pulling more and all the time to do that. Obviously then timing, some people are really happy that we're doing it at the moment, but the city's been a bit quieter because of COVID. Other people think, we're making it even worse. But for a construction project like this, I think there's no good time to do it. The other challenge I have is that our budget was approved in 2017 and it hasn't moved. And if you think about construction costs over that time, the amount I can buy now as part of this project is shrinking rapidly. So it's more important that we get in and do this now. We're already having to cut some things, but we want to still do the best job we can. Trying to move people beyond this thinking of it's going to go back to what it was like before 2020. I don't think it's ever going to go back to what it was like before 2020 in some respects, and really trying to get people at a time that they are battling to just stay in business and stay afloat, stay mentally well, trying to get them to think about, well, how could you innovate? How could you change? That's a really hard conversation to be having at the moment. And I just think the other thing is the inability for anyone these days to go to compromise on anything seems to be really low. People just seem to be really at the end of their resilience. And then you come in and go, now we're going to dig up this road in front of you for 6 months. But what has worked well? The relationship with Kaitahu and the work on the cultural narrative to pull that in twofold. I think we've ended up with a absolutely fantastic design. I just think it's really beautiful and it's going to be really different. And I remember someone in the comments, I don't read the comments often, but someone had said in there, and this was like my best comment of the day, it said, I really wanted to hate this, but I don't. And I was like, boom, we've changed one person's mind. But it's also, yeah, from the beginning, it was that development of principles. They wanted to hate it because it was council. That's, I think, the main thing. But the development of the principles that guided the design, you know, things like kaipokai, the exchange, things around manaakitanga, things around use of cultural resources, you know, influencing things like the planting, etc. It's both that, it's then the design, but it's also the process we've been on. So all of us in the design team and construction team have learned so much. And it also means that now this afternoon got word that I can launch another project, which is quite exciting. And that one, we're looking, well, what do we take to the next step? Because this has worked so well, but this isn't the end of that journey. This is the start of that journey. How can we do this better for our next projects as well in terms of working in partnership? A focus on accessibility for all ages and abilities. That's where I get a little bit of, you know, when you are challenged for people are saying, at a business owner at a Chamber of Commerce type group the other week say, why are you even providing disabled parking? He's like, that, you know, it's hardly ever occupied. I'm like, I can't believe I'm having to justify that. You know, being able to come back and go, again, it's about accessibility for all parts of the community. And if you're not appealing to that community at the moment, they might have money that they could be spending in your shop. And maybe if you're thinking retail's not going so well, appealing to a broader audience might be a good thing. Try to balance all the modes of transport, ensure there's some improvement for each one of them. So, you know, hopefully congestion will be less bad, there'll be still parking, but it's also much better for cyclists. We've already noticed there's more cyclists using the road now, as we've just closed one section. The strong partnership we have with our design and construction team. We're working for the first time with Isaac Construction out of Christchurch, and we've got Jazz Max, ACOM involved, and the kaupapa in their partnership is really important that they, you know, Isaac do a lot around natural, you know, rehabilitation of places and, you know, in nature, and it's been amazing working with their team. And in terms of the contractors, I've never worked with people who are so focused on that they take out people's bins for them each week. If there's something wrong, they've gone to fix things for people in their shops. You know, they've carried stock for people across the road. You know, they're always trying to be really helpful. And it's those little minor things. This week they came to me and said, oh, we want to just do something else. Oh, what's that? And they're like, we're buying a window cleaner and a vacuum for the street so we can go through every week. Every night we'll go through a vacuum, so it's really nice. And then we'll clean everyone's windows once a week. And I was like, wow, I said, that stuff, you're going to make it look so good during the construction period that when you go, we won't be able to maintain that standard. And they're like, bring back the road workers, you know? And acknowledging, you know, sort of the challenges, trying to provide some tools for the businesses. So alongside the construction, we've got free business mentoring provided through Business South for retailers. We've done a series of digital workshops, which is helping businesses to get online, to think about how they might do their marketing differently. And we're also doing a major marketing campaign, which is the first real CBD marketing campaign that's been there for a very, very long time. Some interim thoughts. It's all about communications and that necessity of personal contact. And that's still a work in progress. There's been, over the last couple of weeks, there's been some real ups and downs, and all of the times that things aren't going as well as if it's just because we haven't had enough time with that person. Like, it's always, I always have this thing where I think I create the problem, because in my head I think, oh shit, I haven't heard from such and such an owner for a while and they've been complaining lots. Pick up my phone, of course, 5 minutes later there's a complaint from them. You're like, that was a signal to me that even I knew I hadn't been back and talked to them recently enough. So it is really about trying to push, having people out there. So we've, as of next week, I think we will have employed someone whose basic job is that they will just spend all of their days going door to door, checking everyone's okay, bringing back any feedback, but also just keeping that level of, are you doing okay? The importance of some cheerleaders. So those are the supportive businesses, and looking at the project in a holistic way. So for me, it's like, this is an infrastructure project. But for this infrastructure project to work, there's a whole lot of other stuff that needs to happen. And we can't divorce the fact that retail is changing and people are, there's new habits, the way that people are shopping online, etc. We need to kind of help our businesses adapt to that, provide a place that people want to come and want to spend money, and do things like help try and set up this, local, Central City retailers group, so that they actually have a body that they can then start taking on this marketing in the future. They can start lobbying, they can start organising things. So at the moment, everyone's just delegating that to council, and when we do it, no one likes it anyway. So we might as well try and upskill people to do it themselves. So sort of that empowering people to do it. The importance of well-funded comms and marketing campaign. Ours is around, it's called Totally Gorgeous. That's what the company pitched us that got it, and we love it. We think it's really cool. The local paper hates it. They think it's garish. And so as a result of them telling us that, we're making it more and more camp all the time and throwing rainbows and different colours into it. But what we've found is it's quite strongly a generational thing again, that younger people love it, older people just don't get it. Because apparently there was a drag queen on RuPaul's Drag Race called Georges as well. Yeah, it is a good drag name. So we've got these t-shirts with Totally Gorgeous over them and stuff. But yeah. But we figured it's we've got to have some fun with it as well. You've got to have people come to laugh. And we want people to keep coming to town. So that's me, and I'm open to questions.
Remember the one-way section, is it just one way for motorists, not for cyclists?
Yes, that has been one of the more controversial parts of it. It is just one way for motorists, and that question then came up: do you have a separate cycle lane for the contraflow? And we decided not to go for that because the whole ethos of the area is share with care. So the thing we're focused on is if cyclists, whether it's a cyclist, whether it's a motorist, if you're trying to get from A to B as quickly as possible, we have a one-way state highway with cycle lanes, separated cycle lanes, that enables that to happen. We'll do things like putting the cycle parking at the ends of the blocks as well to encourage people to park up and then walk to their destination. But also we've figured we've got neon scooters and all that kind of thing in town as well. So it really is trying to keep people to, we have what we're calling a contraflow area, but it's not a designated lane marked out, because we don't want people thinking this is my cycle lane, so I can fly through it at 40 km an hour. Yeah.
So what's the expected completion date for
The whole thing?
Yeah.
So our first block will finish end of September. So that's the farmers block. And you may understand some timing about what happens in October, about why we might be trying to finish a block before the elections. But also because it's a short block, and we think things that I've noticed is that even whether it's renders, whether it's plans, people can't read them. Like, people really struggle. So I'll show the pictures and people will be like, oh, but everyone's walking down here. It's like, no, there's still, the footpath is mostly overstood by the buildings. We're just offering a whole lot of extra space using other ways. But entirety is supposed to be by just mid-2024. I suspect it'll be the end of 2024, but our goal is mid-2024.
Did you sort of look at the planning rules as well as part of that project or not?
That had already been done as part of the 2GP.
Yeah.
And that zone being our main central city one is pretty permissive as it is. I think there's a few things that are starting to come up now that are a couple of councillors' main bugbears around things like the size of signage and stuff like that. And their concern is we'll do a whole lot of work to make things beautiful and it will still look cluttered with signs. So there's a few tweaks I think that will come from that, but mostly it's a pretty enabling zone.
Those that think I've just arrived, I got to this part of the session. So
And then had to leave.
I had to go away. So I am kind of.
I'm hoping I didn't contradict myself.
The 2.10 I was interested, like, probably there's a lot of debate around whether we should make a portion of the main street a mall, whether we should go one way. I'm kind of cool with either of those. How did you get it past your retailers? Because that's their resistance is if you, you know, if you can't go both ways and park on both sides, my shop's going to die. I'm just interested in a process that you went through.
Well, to be honest, that process never happened, and that's where most of the contention still comes from. There was a large petition signed by 6,500 people saying that they didn't want it to change from one way to two way, from two way to one way. And so that's why we went through kind of the detailed business case process that we had to go through to try and access Whakatahi funding, was to say, is there any evidence that would show if we pedestrianise it, if we turn it one way, if we do this, is there any evidence that can conclusively show us that that will have a detrimental effect? We weren't able to find that. A lot of it's gut feeling, anecdote. So it didn't happen. And in the end, what we did is we took the cheats way out, if you like, and as staff, we said, either of these two options can work. Retail, and we presented it that on the two-way side, the retailers prefer this. Most of the retailers prefer this. And on this side, you've got the disability groups, most of the age groups, students, and environmental groups, they all want this. You guys are the council, you decide.
Okay, thanks for that.
and then it became a big fight.
My first term councillor, and I was intrigued earlier when you said out-of-town consultants came and said, do this area up. Sometimes we're frightened to challenge them because they apparently know so much. How did you manage to persuade your group and everyone else, actually that's the wrong plan, what we need to do is a block over and do that?
I think the key thing for us is working collaboratively with the consultants. So I think there's always a danger of just like giving a project and then just like waiting for it to come in at the end. I'm probably like most of the consultants' worst nightmare because I want to be involved the whole way through. And particularly for something like this where we're looking at one way versus two way, I was constantly, I don't want to say I was devil's advocate because I know that's always like kind of a negative position to come from, but so often I'd be like, look, I live here and I don't think that'll work. So you need to test that better, or don't use that example because I don't think there's a similar, it's like you can give me Fort Street as much as you want in Auckland, but we're not Auckland. Our factors are different. So let's think about, can we find similar cities? Or can we just find other evidence that will back that up? And I think we as the design team and the team working on this, that robust discussion has actually been really, really important because it also helped me prepare for some fairly marathon sessions at council with councillors. I think with the one in September was 4 hours long of being grilled. Is this going to work? Is this going to work? So I think just keeping closely working with those consultants in a team environment, rather than just package this work, you give us the outcomes.
My final question, I happened to be in Dunedin on Sunday. with the loop around the Octagon. And a bit like Timaru, we get to a certain point and shops disappear and other things happen. And I know where you did your old area, there's kind of a big gap to George Street and the Octagon.
Yeah, there is a big dead zone in the middle.
But yeah, look, the dead zone, we've got a dead zone too. And for some reason, people believe retail is suddenly going to appear, even though my mother, who's been here for 70 years, said from the Oxford up was always kind of dead because we built our towns 100 years ago and people need to acknowledge things change. What can we do with the dead end?
Yeah. So that's a really interesting one because that was part of the conversation that happened quite a bit about when we started the Warehouse Precinct. A number of people who have businesses in that, it's not quite a dead zone, but I'll paraphrase it as a dead zone, which is Princes Street, which has struggled for a long time, same probably as here, we've had our development will move northwards and then consolidate. And so they're saying, why are you going to the Warehouse Precinct first? Why aren't you trying to do something for us? My argument for that was always, if we create a critical mass of people living and working in that area, that will naturally spill out and they'll need retail back onto Princes Street. And that started to happen in parts of South Princes Street. The main barrier to getting some of that to occur further than what it has at the moment is there's a couple of really significant blocks of buildings that are owned by out-of-town owners that have done nothing with them. There's a group of 5 buildings in South Princes Street that are about to collapse onto the street, owned by a Christchurch developer who is just determined to demolish them. And they've been going for 13 years trying to get that demolition through. And there's a couple of buildings like that in other parts of Princes Street. The key for me is we're not going to get retail back, traditional retail back into those areas. And there's no point in us trying because we'll be robbing Peter to pay Paul. So when you think about other uses for those buildings, one of the key benefits of some of the stuff that's happened in George Street, though, this came up in a seismic question in the other session, was that by upgrading the upper floors of those buildings and getting residential apartments in there, sometimes it means they can take a lower paying tenant at the ground floor and still make a profit off the building. And that enables a different type of use or some more marginal retailers to move in. And so that can be a positive that instead of just relying on one high-paying tenant at the ground floor, you've got 2 or 3 apartments upstairs, you can experiment a bit more with the bottom. So I think it's about trying to find what are those other uses because we're not going to get retail back into them.
Yeah, no, look, I agree. Thanks for that.
All right.
Thank you, it's awesome.
No worries. Thank you.
But that was kind of what you were saying in your first part of it. You talk about the Warehouse Precinct and that there were other uses in there. So there was residential, there were hospitality, cafes, office, that weren't traditional sort of high street retail. That actually work now, and actually people want to go into those areas. So you can create that activity in those places, regenerating them with a different use, that adaptive reuse.
Absolutely, and I think coming back to one of your questions is also thinking about how do you write a plan, even a district plan for that? Because when we were starting to work through some of the activities that were coming into the Warehouse Precinct, I can remember one of the first ones that came in ostensibly looked like a wine shop. It's a wine shop, but like he also did a whole lot of stuff around education, like big wine tasting evenings. And the space he needed, he couldn't afford to lease a traditional retail space on George Street to do all of these other activities he needed. So for him moving to the Warehouse Precinct where he got a different kind of space that was suitable, but at the time we would have just gone, he's retail, so he can't be there. So the thing was trying to think about, well, what are the different so there was some pretty imaginative framing of what some of those businesses were to get them through consent processes. But it's also acknowledging that our definitions sometimes are too restrictive, and businesses in particular, I think more and more now, aren't just strictly retail or industrial or office. Like they're a mix of all of these things. And that's where having some flexibility, I think, is really important. The other thing is, just quickly, that one of the challenges I said there was like the cost of the leases in George Street. What we found was someone like one of the cafes that opened up down there, she had tried to be on George Street to start with. She'd gone to a number and she couldn't find a space that she could afford and an owner of that building that would work with her. because it's relatively held in a small amount of owners. And she needed us to open up other parts of the city for those activities so she could actually open what is now one of the most successful cafes in the city. So sometimes there might be theoretically space available out there, but because of the nature of the ownership, what they're expecting in terms of returns, it's not going to happen there. And you kind of do need to have a bit of surplus to let people move into.
So how did the councils go about leading this?
In terms of Warehouse or in terms of
the
George
Street?
I think there hasn't been a natural desire from anyone after it's been contentious from the beginning. We always knew it was going to be contentious. Anytime you touch the main street, you know it's going to be, people are going to have opinions. In the city, I guess the main councillors who have pushed the project and were really keen to see it happen have been the Mayor and the Chair of the Planning and Environment Committee. And that, I think, has been fantastic to have support from those members. And it ended up being 9-6 anyway. So, so there's other councillors that supported it too. But there's also been like a challenge with that, and that they are strongly seen as a Green candidate and a Labour candidate. So some of the other opposition to some of the elements of the project, I think if it had been led by other councillors, you wouldn't have seen the same thing. But even something as recently, I've had a couple of the other councillors who said, look, I voted against in September's meeting last year against the one way, but now I've seen the plans. I think it's really cool. You're like, I'm not necessarily going to say that publicly, but I think it's really cool. So I think it is a case of, again, it's that whole sometimes seeing things on a plan or trying to put, trying to envisage what it's going to be like is really hard. But at the end of the day, I think some of the day that they decided on one way versus two way, not only did I sit in front of them for like 4 hours being grilled, was that a number of members of the public came into public forum to speak to it, and they've been people that have been involved in the consultation process. And quite honestly, some of the people who spoke, like it was like some of my proudest moments in my career, where you hear people, particularly on the, like I'm entirely ambivalent. I do not care either way, whether it's one way or two way. And that's why I always say to people, I'm completely agnostic.
Be honest.
No, I really don't. And actually, if I'm really honest, when they made the first decision before I came back, I was like, what? How did you do that? Like, where did that come from? And that's why I tested it so hard through the detailed business cases. I really want to make sure, because the consultants can leave. I still have to live here and walk down the street every day. This has to be able to work. So I did push really hard to make sure that, that they were absolutely sure that one way or two way could work. And now, like, we could have got either of the both outcomes. I think direction is a red herring, actually. What's more important is that it's somewhere exciting that people want to visit, and that actually we start doing things like marketing the city. That's getting people back in is more important than anything else. At the moment, the big argument that we've been discussing is we need all of our council staff to be back in the buildings. We need the university staff to be back in their buildings. We need people not working from home as much, because those people are in there every day spending money in cafes and and retailers. They're not there at the moment. That's the biggest issue. But in terms of sort of some of those people that came to talk at the public forum, particularly those who were talking about wanting change, they were like so articulate, and like they could they had really thought it through and really passionate about it. And many of the people that were anti the change just came across as being grumpy and old. Really, and it was kind of like it was like sad. I remember, like, I'm not going to mention the group, but they were an advocate for a certain type of transport, and they came in and it was just like they had been in these workshops with all these other people where they had listened to members of the disability community saying, we really want this, and they still would never admit. And at one of the workshops, one of the retailers sat there and mansplained to the student, the university chair of the University Students Association, what students wanted. And I was like, you're like 65 years old. And it was just like, you see other people in the room, just like, he was just undermining his own argument. And I was like, you're defeating yourself in this argument. You know, so it was a case of like, a lot of the people pro-change just were more articulate. And I think that's what swayed a lot of the councillors too.
Just briefly, sorry, you mentioned, I heard your video talking about George Street. You mentioned, could you just briefly talk about the heritage strategy in terms of the buildings and the planting and...
Yeah, so one of the things that we've kind of noticed is, so George Street is predominantly a lot of Victorian Edwardian facades. The problem is that I guess the last time the design was quite, didn't really think about what the buildings were so much. So we ended up with, we've got some really large trees, for example, planted in front of all the heritage buildings so you can't see the facades. Also creates a whole lot of really bad maintenance issues, that we've got London plane trees that have really massive deciduous leaves. They fill up the box gutters behind the parapets. It creates all sorts of leakages and costs for owners. So one of the things we're determined to do is to really think about the placement of all of those things. So really the plan marks out all of the heritage facades along the street and avoids putting trees in front of those wherever possible, and instead with low planting. We're also working on a website, which is just underway now. Tentatively, it's kind of called Hidden in Plain Sight, because there's so many stories around those buildings that we couldn't stick a panel outside each one. We'd clutter it up, and it's also that information is kind of being added to all the time. So what we're trying to do is pull this website together as a bit of a portal that you're able to click on a QR code or something and go investigate more about those buildings. There's also things like going through, we found all these really amazing photos of some of the people that worked in the buildings in the past. There's an amazing one of one of the chemists. And we were kind of using it, thinking about using it, one of our promos for the project. So all the people standing in the chemist at that stage were all these men in, you know, like little white chemisty coats. And you kind of think, if I go into a chemist today, it's probably going to be quite different. There'll be more women, there'll be more people from other cultures. And we're kind of showing, you know, that things have changed. But then also a lot of the buildings there, members of my project team, their grandparents ran a Chinese restaurant on that street. There's also, you know, the really strong Jewish community. And you kind of like, that diversity has actually always been there. We just haven't necessarily shown it. So that's why we also want to use the web portal to show some of those stories as well. So that we can have a really strong mana whenua expression. We've got the very strong colonial expression in the buildings, but then it's the stories of people that we need to tell a lot better. And that's going to be something that we'll work on. I think that will be a legacy project. I think that one.
Just on.
Oh, sorry, I've got one here.
Talked about bollards at the end of the blocks to close it off for festivals or whatever. Are they the type that can sit under the ground and you just pop them
Correct,
up?
like the bully boy type ones. Yeah. And we think there's other guys has found there's an app that we can run it through as well. Yeah, there's an app for that. So that's
like set them to go at a certain time.
Yeah, or just also it's handy for us that that can then be available to emergency services if they want to either close or open the block as well. So they, so that means the fire service can close the block and then come in from the wrong direction if they want to.
You just mentioned too that you were thinking of repurposing some of the parts.
Yeah, that's one of our slightly more ambitious.
Could you not use that type of bollard to take those parts?
Yeah, that's certainly one option. The only problem with the bollards is they're really, really expensive. Yeah. And also we're trying to do away with having like a stream of bollards being the barrier. Yeah. But we have been looking at things overseas where they do, you might have LED lighting and that might be green at certain times or red depending on what time of day it is, and the digital street signs for the parking as well.
Problem is, they're not a physical deterrent for people to.
No, and you do kind of need something
synonymous with. Not obeying unless
exactly.
It's physical.
Yeah, we have there's someone in council that's like that. It's just like it's pavement, I'm going to park on it. You're like, especially in a shared space, that's not going to be great. But so we're still working through that and trying to figure out that. And the big thing for us is what is the software that we need that we can then link all of that up so that the traffic lights also change so that they're not providing a phase if we don't need the phase, because we've still got to get that east-west traffic across. Yes. And it's also making sure that emergency services can get in, but also one of the key things that councillors have been on at us, and this is a result of closures we've had before, is if you can do anything to close things without using as many orange cones, we'd be really happy. So we're trying to engineer things in so that hopefully we can get away from some of that really unattractive traffic management. Sorry.
I thought Nigel's talking about my daughter and a friend and I walked through town and they asked me what our fetish with old was. Like even new stuff you build, you make it to look old.
And Timaru.
This is in Timaru. And I like the chairs you had outside the old buildings that were cloud or wave formation because they were totally funky. Because right now, I think if we put a seat in the main street, it'd have cast ends that would make it look
and that's
old.
what we have now. So all of our street furniture in the current upgrade that was done 30 years ago is all made to look that it's replica in some way. And there was a very strong push from some members of the community that that's what they wanted to see again. But I guess what sort of happened over the last few years, and it's more heritage best practice now to contrast sympathetically than to replicate if it's not actually a proper replica. So, and I think the other thing is something that came up I was lecturing to some students a few weeks ago, and it was the first time that I'd really heard people refer to old architecture in the city, and I think this is like a generational change. There was two things that came out. One was first that they called it colonial architecture rather than heritage architecture, and I was like, there's a value judgment in there as well that I think is partly related to younger generations being further and further afield from or coming from the UK or whatever. And the second element was that they said every generation should have its right to impart something on the city and not to lock the city up into the past. And that was actually quite powerful for me to think, actually, what is the legacy that this generation can leave on the city? And if that's more around more sustainable ways of managing our rainwater work and things like that we're trying to do, then that's a positive and we should embrace that.
And how did you get the youth and younger people involved to have a real voice? Because that's
they are tough. Through the during the development of the plans, they set up a central city advisory group, which was made up of a number of different groups. There's representative retailers, building owners, emergency services, police, etc. Then there was also OUSA chair, the Polytech chair, so the student representatives, Gen Zero, Youth Council, rep. That might be it, but they were then really strong in passing that out to their networks. And I think because they felt that they were genuinely being listened to, they then pushed it. But it's really interesting then seeing kind of the backlash from some of the other groups, like the AA and stuff, being like, well, what do they know? Or like, I remember someone from Grey Power being like, they're all going to leave anyway. And it's like, but they get replaced by other students. Like, and Grey Power, you're all going to leave too, but you're going to like, but there's going to be more of you as well. So, so yeah, I think it's one of those ones where also because it was a project that's, I guess, has been seen to be led a lot by the mayor. And because the mayor is a relatively young mayor and came from a university background, there's always been kind of a strong support from that sector as well.
That's a good question. Not thinking so much of George Street and more the Warehouse Precinct. Do you have any thoughts about allowing residential at grade? Because it's something we've talked about internally in terms of pros and cons where retail is struggling to hang on.
Yep. It's a debate that we did a lot of work around that when we were doing the 2GP. In the Warehouse Precinct, in some buildings it's allowed because it's not strictly at grade, because a number of those buildings have semi-buried basements. So already the ground floor window is already up here anyway. So in those buildings, we've said, yep, that's okay. Some other parts of the city, we have recently had some at-grade residential development, but because they've mostly been on quite steep hills, the apartments have already kind of been up a little bit higher and then stagger down the hill as you go anyway. I think we've shied away from it generally though, because what the worst outcome that we've seen is not in new builds, it's in retrofitting, where you just end up with a shop window in someone's lounge. And it ain't great. We think either for the people living there or, for the streetscape as well. The only places that we've seen that has worked is where you do like a setback and part of it is still, there's a bit of a buffer before. I was in Wellington a couple of weeks ago and there's a new development up there on Taranaki Street that has at grade studio apartments, like right on the footpath. And I was like, whoa, like this is, they're all empty at the moment, but you just like look and there's like a little lounge and a kitchenette. And they can either be used as commercial or residential. And I was like, wow, if that was your residential, that could be, I don't know, I don't think it's a great outcome.
People in Wellington are probably just desperate for somewhere to live.
Yeah, exactly.
But I just want to live in the city.
Yeah,
I don't care if
everyone can see me getting changed. I just want a house.
Okay, sorry, just if I can clarify, so are you saying it's not a great outcome in areas where you would expect and want retail to continue to be a primary activity?
Or more
if you've got
active.
an area where you're expecting, it seems likely that the days of retail in that area are limited, would you still see it as
No, I wouldn't see it as negative there.
Okay.
So that's where we've kind of had some where it has happened, it's been kind of more on the fringe around in some of the back streets. And there it has actually worked, particularly in new developments where they have created a little buffer or there's a little a small terrace space. Because in those areas we're never going to get residential. Never going to get retail back. And how much worse is residential at grade there than someone sitting in an office looking at you?
or a vacant shop?
Yeah.
It's also to do with that sort of solid to void ratio at ground floor. If it's shop front all glass, very, very difficult to convert that to residential. Whereas if it's an older building with smaller windows,
that can work quite well. That's why I think it works better in the Warehouse Precinct too, because we didn't have big plate glass windows. It's mostly still original windows, and they are smaller. They're a bit higher, so you can kind of get away with it there. So I think it's clever design can work. But if they're just going to do it the cheapest possible way and you just end up with someone with deck curtains and that's now their lounge, not a great outcome for anyone.
Coming at it from not advocating, but just sort of looking, as you said, about really making sure we've got the data to put in front of our much respected councillors for when they make the difficult decisions. And some of that, some of that data has appeared to suggest that there's, from a development point of view, that where terraced housing might be economical in areas where perhaps apartments are less so, and so whether that would be something that our planners.
I would endorse that. And that's, I think, what we've seen. We're only really starting to get new apartment developments in Dunedin over the last couple of years. There's been a lot of retrofitting of old buildings, but now we're actually getting build new apartments as well. And I think partly that's because the cost of housing has gone up so much, it's now economic to do it. But the terrace stuff, I think, is more valid for cities of our scale and your scale, where it's no one wants, no one can really afford to build 5-7 stories, but a couple of stories of terraced housing. And I think particularly if you think about people, aging population, people with disabilities, ground floor, pretty important.
Rosie, this is a question to Rosie and Bede. You're talking about George Street and you're doing infrastructure underneath. Have we checked out what our infrastructure is like so we don't do this?
It's the same. Simon can talk to that. Selwyn's not here from Drainage and Water, but they're waiting. Everybody's lined up internally to make sure we only dig things up the once.
There's nothing that winds ratepayers up, then we put the paving down,
and then
telecoms come and put the
1 year later.
That's a completely different scenario, and that's an interesting one that, if I may, I'll just jump in on that one. So yes, council, easier to organise your 3 waters.
Yes.
But I am talking data.
That's our problem.
Alpine, all those other things.
So start the conversations early. We've been doing that a wee bit, but even like last time on George Street when they did it, 30 years ago, they stuck out a whole lot of ducts to feed new stuff through. Chorus came through and put new ones in anyway, just dug where they wanted. So it's like you can try and future-proof it as much as you want, but they're still going to do it. And at the moment we're doing this because they're also upgrading, Aurora's upgrading the power cables, so as much as possible we're trying to say no one should be digging for the next 5 years.
So we actually, I was having a chat with, I want to say Rob, I could have forgotten his name in a moment, Chorus at the moment, because we want to run a bit of a campaign with business and building owners along the lines of don't be that guy, because everybody's shifting to fibre, but if you get 1 or 2 businesses that wait to get their fibre connection, well, you've laid your beautiful new paving and then that has to be dug up for that business. So we are going to try and really proactively get people across with that as well. So
one of our councillors during the hearings came up with it. He was like, why don't we just build a massive tunnel under George Street and put all the services in there? And I was like, right, I really love that idea. And I was like, you do know what our budgets are though, don't you? Like, how much are you willing to approve?
You can run your tram through it.
Yeah, exactly. I know. Someone emailed me the other day, said there already was a tunnel like that under George Street. I was like, I can assure you there isn't. If there was, that would make our lives a lot easier.
Can I ask you a question related to that? So we haven't had 7 years of consultation, but we've had a 5-year dialogue to get to where we are now. And there've been a lot of ideas put forward during that time that would have really significant budgetary implications, like a monorail or a tram or a bridge from the top end of Stephen Street to Caroline Bay or whatever it is. And one of the things that we're looking at is just balancing people's expectations with the available budget. And a question I have is, how far do you go with the ideas that aren't going to progress because the money isn't there or we don't own the asset or something like that? How far have you gone in terms of gathering data and demonstrating to people why those ideas aren't going anywhere? Or have you just sort of said, no, we're going to put all our resources on the things that will?
It's more the latter, because I think you can easily go down rabbit holes.
Yeah.
I'd like to say that we could give more information about why some ideas won't work or test them more, but often it's going to take you down a rabbit hole. Or it's going to take time. And more often just saying that, like that's just out of scope for now, or, that's something that councils would have to look at in the future. It's not an easy one because some people will just feel they're being fobbed off.
Yeah.
But most of the time, most of the ones that we've had have been, clearly you can go, that's just going to be way too expensive. A more interesting one that has come up, it's not interesting in a sense, but it's like more complicated, is a number of councillors who wanted to kind of hedge their bets, and I'm not saying that in a negative way, but hedge their bets just in case one way doesn't work. They said, well, could you still build the road underneath so it could take vehicles in 2 directions so that if we need to, we can put it back? So the first resolution was a one-way that could go back to 2-way, and we had to go back and say, actually, there's a number of costs that would add. Plus, you're then going to have additional months of disruption, and that won't be co-funded by Whakatāhi. And that was enough to kind of, we didn't have to go too in depth, but having our QS involved and the builders, they could say this is what it's going to cost. But it still comes up today. The ODT still pushes on. It's like, why is it so much? So they found what looked like a loophole, but wasn't, because we said in the detailed business case it would cost 19 million or 20 million to build a one-way or a two-way. So there's only $1 million difference basically to do that. But then we came up with, if you wanted to change it, it would be $7 to $8 million. And they couldn't see why there was a difference of 1 million. Like, what did we? It was like, well, but we've already built something, and we're going to have to take it out and then put something else in. So it was a bit of explaining, but it does kind of show, even to saying to the councillors, that's what seems like a great idea of making it robust that we can do that, is we're still going to have to move a whole lot of things, and it constrains a huge lot of options that we've got at the moment in terms of where we can relay our infrastructure. Because if we can relay it here at the moment, if that's going to be under the road, we've just defeated the purpose of moving some of it. So it's not an easy one, but most of the time people will accept. There's not been too many people that chase. And then, as I said at dinner, there's a couple of people that you do just have to be quite blunt with as well when they push the same things. It's just like, it's just not a good idea.
In in terms of planning, hold the breath, Mark, is what changes did you have to make beforehand? Like we had they're going in too much. We weren't allowed to reverse a truck on a street because it was a safety hazard. So we're spending another $500,000 to do something else. Thought it was ridiculous, but it is what it is. How much planning did you change up front so it smoothed the way to what you wanted to do?
Not a lot. A lot of it came through the process for the Warehouse Precinct because we were in the process of reviewing our district plan at the time. So it was kind of, we almost used that area as a bit of an experiment to see like how could these things run, what is likely to want to go in the area. For Central City, not much at all, but you raise it because we've already just done the district plan review and it isn't really permissive zone. But we are constantly finding new things. Or like today, I just saw an email come through while I was coming up that was, we're putting in overhead lighting as part of the display for amenity purposes. And they're like, so what size of truck can get under there? Because basically the road has to be open for all of these vehicles all of the time in case one of them accidentally goes down there. And you're like, so for the one-off chance that someone's going to drive the wrong way, we have to either put the lights up higher, which is then going to interfere with apartments, or, you know, are we just allowed to run the risk if someone hits it and we have to replace it? You know, so. And another one I had the other day, same sort of thing. There's a like a right of way going down that's a single lane. They have no turnaround. They have to back out of it. Well, they shouldn't be doing that onto the main street. But they want to keep it, and we don't want to enter a fight with them to get rid of it. But as a result, the turning maneuvers into it means that we lose like 4 or 5 car parks on the street. So it is that constant tension between, to save an argument and not have 2 people park here, I'm going to lose 5 people's ability to park out here. And it is a constant frustration. They certainly, all of the standards don't make it easy.
We have a permissible zone here.
Oh, totally. Yeah, I mean,
Your Central City would be, wouldn't it?
yeah. And so you explained before how the Warehouse Precinct was a sort of large format retail, and you know what ours is. It's really trying to enable as much as we possibly can, and sort of quite aligning with DCC's in that it's still got control over the heritage of the look of the building, but it's trying to enable as much as we can. In fact, we're actually even trying to enable stuff where you go, oh, that may be a little bit inappropriate, but because we're trying to enable use in these buildings, we'll just let it, you know, we'll let that use be okay.
Yeah.
I think for towns and cities like ours, we have to be as permissive as possible in those spaces to allow as many activities. Also based on the previous comment I made that it's harder and harder to define activities as clearly as they were in the past. You know, things like, you know, things are more fluid in what they do within a building, and it's not just clearly retail or, you know, you've got to have that scope. You know, where the debate around, you know, whether some IT businesses were industrial, because we're like, well, but they're creating a product. It's just that product's digital. Are they an office or are they industry?
Yes,
Doesn't really matter, is it? I mean, you need that flexibility.
I think so, and I think more exciting places have.
Well, exactly. It allows that invention, that creativity. So a business that might be between 2 sort of models will actually sort of, you know, develop, and it could be something completely new and unique. And you want those opportunities to be able to flourish.
I totally agree. And I think, yeah, the places that are just too much of one thing, they're boring as well. You know, you're just going to end up with the same type of.
I mean, especially with all the pressures on different businesses, retail, and how that is rapidly changing, they're constantly having to reinvent themselves. So, you know, you've got to give them that opportunity to do that. It might not work, but, you know, at least they can try it out and it might evolve on from that. So
I was interested the other day, I went into a radiology place in Dunedin, which, you know, was there because it was a health was allowed. I was kind of looking at it, I was like, the machinery they've got in there is way more damaging, right, to people's, you know, well-being and health, potentially, you know, like MRI machines and stuff, than some of the other activities that we wouldn't potentially allow in that area. You know, you're like, well, you know, you've got to come down to what are the effects of that activity.
Yeah.
Or can you speak from your experience when you might have a building owner who's willing to do the remediation work or some kind of adaptive reuse of their building but has existing tenants in there? and perhaps different tenants on different floors, their leases expire at different times and all of that carrying on. Did council play a role in terms of negotiating or supporting the conversations that needed to happen between the building owners and the business owners and that tenant displacement issue?
No, we didn't tend to, but what we did, I'll come back to a point of what we had been asked to do by one. I'll first off answer no, but in the sense that what we did do though was work with our building services department to work on how we could stage consents on the acknowledgement that a building wouldn't always become all vacant at the same time, and that it was better to have some staging of those upgrades to an overall plan over 5 years than it was to say, no, you can't do anything until the whole building's vacant. Obviously imparts some risk to council, and so you want to be really careful about that. And one of the things I noticed on that when I was going back and looking at a couple of consents is making sure that you have triggers to remind yourself to go back and check that they've then started the next stage of work. So that was actually something that worked really well for us in terms of helping people get residential upstairs and maybe still needing to do some of the fire upgrades to the downstairs tenant, do that when that becomes available, as long as it was in reasonable times and there was some other, some upgrades done. One of the a councillor or in previous council had come up with an idea to say, and we didn't take it too seriously, but there could be some merit in it for some, to say, we need to have earthquake strength in our building, and what we don't want to do is kick our tenants out and lose them to a competitor and then not be able to get someone back. So what council could do is have some space to decant people to, because we know you're not going to try and steal our tenants forever. And it was interesting because that came from one of our more smaller government is better government type people. And I was like, that sounds really interventionist to me, but and we didn't take it that seriously at the time, but I think it's something that could be an interesting one for some of those bigger firms, that do need somewhere to go, and those owners are really scared that they're going to lose that tenant over the long term. We've been doing it ourselves within our own buildings. We're having to decant a floor at a time at the moment, and I could see how for a private owner that could be really scary, thinking if they're going to go somewhere else, are they just going to go there permanently? Is that landlord going to sign them into a 5-year deal? Particularly when you've got a few tenants and you don't want them to not do the work.
Did you ever go at a round robin between your buildings?
No, they're been quite fun though.
No, okay.
So it came up again on George Street recently saying, should you have spaces that you can move businesses to while you're working in front of them? The relocation costs though made it pretty unrealistic.
You talked, following on from that point, you talked about the Distinction Hotel and the Warehouse quarter. Was that, did the council facilitate with that, getting them in there, or was that entirely their own?
It was it's a commercial decision, but I guess they asked for some things to sweeten the deal, to make it easier for them to do it. And that was one of the first projects we put through. At the time, we set up a targeted, no, it's not a targeted rate, it was a rates remission scheme, or it was actually a grant, but it looked like a rates remission scheme, which was like a freeze. So we said to people, if you take on a building that has lots of work to do, it's a heritage building, and you're currently paying next to nothing for the rates, we will hold that low level of rates for a certain amount of years and not put your rates up straight away. Now, because of the rating, the way the rating actually can't actually do that, but it has to follow the valuation. So instead we gave them a grant each year for 4 years to reduce it back to the original. So on some buildings that would mean they'd get, $5,000, $10,000, $20,000 a year back. For somewhere like Distinction, that meant we were giving them a grant back of like $100,000 a year for a couple of years. And that I think does help, because they could then say, look, even when we're it particularly came from people like Ted Daniels, who did that apartment. He said, I did this building, because of the way the rating year fell, you revalued it as soon as I'd finished. So my rates jumped from $2,000 a year to $16,000 a year, and I still didn't have tenants. So it was like a big thank you very much for doing this project.
Here's
Your bill. He's like, I'm already paying the other bills. He said, what I really would have liked is just 3 years where you slowly increase that. So that's what we developed this grant scheme to do. And it works really well for some of those buildings.
Did you have any people raising equity issues in terms of the support you were providing for people versus people who had already done the work and stuff that helped?
No, sorry, I'm just going to sit. Yes, there's always that debate. And I guess it came to councillors also had that debate amongst themselves as well, particularly about if you target certain parts of the city, are you putting other parts of the city? And this is something I'm very cognizant of with George Street at the moment, that we're putting $60 million in there, and there'll be other parts of the city that are like, where's ours? And you're there forever. You've taken 10 years to consult. Now you're going to take 3 years to implement. When are we ever going to get a go? And that's obviously a political decision, but it's one that is always in the back of my mind. But one of the really good conversations that I think happened once at council when we were debating like that type of rates remission, rates relief type scheme was one of the councillors said, well, look, we can happily forego that increase in the short term, because if they don't do the work, we won't get any more money out of them anyway. So we're better off taking a bit longer to get that money than we are and not getting it at all. And also the way they looked at it with the Warehouse Precinct was, yes, we might have stuck a couple of $1 million in there. We've got a good return on that investment in terms of what the private sector put in, but the rates on all of those buildings grew significantly. So actually, in a sense, everyone around the city benefited from that, because our rates didn't have to increase as a percentage more when someone like Distinction goes from paying $10,000 a year to $200,000 a year. That's extra money that goes into the pot that I'm not subsidising. So I used to tongue-in-cheek say to the building owners on George Street, you should be happy we're giving these guys money because you're not having to pay extra rates. Otherwise, you'd be burdening all of the rates increase.
So you're obviously rated on capital value, not land value, like here.
I can't remember now. I think
because for someone improving their building,
there's a value of there's the land value, and then there's the value of improvements on top.
We only do land value.
Okay, no, so we do.
So that might make that a wee bit more difficult.
Yeah, often that value of improvements is negligible on some of those buildings. But
But it's taking a longer term view, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's where it was
in the long term, you're getting better payback from it.
And that's what we try to encourage with a lot of the thinking of all the projects that I've been involved in, is take that long term view that it's going to be crappy for a few months now, but think about what it's going to be like next year, the year after. And I had a business owner who I know quite well from the time in the Warehouse Precinct. He had set up a little bakery on George Street, and I was chatting to him and I said, I'm feeling like really low at the moment because I feel really bad about the impact I'm having on businesses after COVID, and I just feel like, am I pushing them all to bankruptcy? And I know, he's just like, I wear this and I take this home with me and I'm not sleeping. And he's like, dude, like, don't take it so bad. He's like, in reality, I chose not to work in council. I chose to work as a private business person. And I understood that entailed risks. He's like, give me a little pep talk about it. He's like, and that risk means that at the moment, I'm losing quite a lot of money. But he said, before that, I was making quite a lot of money. And in a couple of years, I'll be making quite a lot of money again. And I'm not going to be sharing that with you. So you don't need to share the losses with me at the moment. He said, that's swings and roundabouts. I will make that back. He said, I'll complain about it at the moment, but in a couple of years, I'll be back overseas on ski trips. And, I was like, well, that is another way to think about it. It's taking that long-term view that, it's really bad at the moment, but don't get too fixated on that. And that's something that's come up a lot with councillors just recently, has been, should we be, like they've done with the City Rail in Auckland just recently, should we be giving them financial handouts? The discussion that's been a lot about that as well. If you do that, every infrastructure project you do will just balloon in cost. And also, am I going to go back to you in 5 years' time when your value has increased a whole lot and say, can I have all of that money back because the infrastructure we works did now means your property's worth twice as much.
You won't get that.
You won't get it back. So
Yeah.
it is, it swings and roundabouts.
What about ECs and GCs? Did you reducing those or try and help with redevelopment?
No, they've all just gone up. Like they haven't gone down, unfortunately. Originally, there had been some discussion, and I don't know where it got to. There had been some discussion about wiping development contributions if it was reuse of a heritage building. And I think that had always kind of been the intent, but it was quite hard to administer because they're kind of like, well, you've already got infrastructure to it. But then if you were massively increasing the intensity, there was still an argument. But I don't know, my own personal opinion on that is maybe different from council's line, so probably best not to say anything.
We haven't got one yet.
Yeah, so we introduced one probably about 10 years ago. And I think recently it was the charges were increased, probably mid last year, I think. And as a result, there was a massive flurry just before everything increased, which also was interesting because it meant then that our planning team was under like major pressure trying to process all these subdivision consents and everything. So there was some negative ramifications from it too.
Yes, it proves if there was a massive flurry that it's development is sensitive to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was at a time when it was booming as well in terms of property. That has edged off recently in Dunedin.
I'm really mindful of time, everyone, because Glenn, this is the second time he's done this presentation and session, and he's had a long drive today. Are there any final questions, or we can follow up with Glenn after today?
What was your favourite new restaurant? My last question.
Moiety. It's Moiety. It's in like Moiety. Give them a plug. They're down the Warehouse Precinct. Absolutely fantastic. They're one of those places that probably got about 8, 10, 12 tables maybe, and the whole restaurant, the whole kitchen's on display, and the chef talks to you while he's cooking, and it's all like local, and it's not just lamb, it's like it tells you the station it's from and the name and
the name of the
yeah, pretty much. Yeah. No, I went in the first time I went in, I went with a partner, I was like, I hate lamb, never eat lamb, absolutely despise it. But I was like, I'll give it a try. And since that time I was a convert to lamb. So I was like, that was actually incredible. But it's just, again, it's one of those places that it's local people who have set up something really cool and are trying innovative things. And that's why I like to support those types of places. And they're the kinds of things that make a city distinctive, I think.
I'll just, for the benefit of the people online, thank you very much for joining us as well. And if you do have any further questions for Glenn, you can email them through and we'll get some feedback back to you. Glenn's been very generous with his time. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Glenn.
Thank you, and make sure you get down to Dunedin and see things and support our local retailers while they're struggling, while I'm ruining their lives. Nice. Good to see you again. Someone was like, there was someone on LinkedIn a few weeks ago that like had come up with a new term. It was like a person that connects people. It's not like facilitated or something similar in an urban. And I was like, that's what it is. Yeah, that's